The man behind the counter at the bus station slid me a $2 bill as change, and he said, "Everything's gonna change."
Hello, and welcome to Live Through That, the companion podcast to my book where I look at influential 90s musicians and where they are today. I'm Mike Hipple, and on this podcast, we'll dig deeper into a pivotal moment into the lives of some of the artists I feature in the book. You can get yourself a copy of the book now using the promo code PODCAST15 to get 15% off. You can find the link on the main page of the podcast. Today's guest is Chris Ballew from the Presidents of the United States of America. I'm very excited to have him on the show because I have such great memories not only of watching him in the President's heyday here at small clubs in Seattle, but also because I loved going to his shows as Casper Babypants with my kids in the 2000s. No matter whether he's playing music for adults or music for kids, the guy is a fantastic live musician and all-around great guy. Today, he shares with us his journey from sideman to band member to solo artist.
First, the earth was a ball of molten lava. Then, a lightning strike created life, and life crawled out of the lava. No, that's not right. Life can't crawl out of lava. What am I talking about? I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not a scientist. I'm a musician, which is why life for me began with a hammer and a piano. When I was a tiny, tiny child, the first experience I had with making quote-unquote music was banging on a piano with a hammer. I just thought it sounded amazing because the strings in the piano would vibrate and make this, unbelievable sound, unrealistic sound, unbelievable. And I just loved banging on that piano with that hammer. And those divots from that piano banging session or the series of sessions stayed on the piano. And as I grew up and got better at playing the actual keys on the piano, I could stare down at those divots and remember my origins. Simultaneously, I discovered the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And that album really sent my child brain on a journey every time I listened to it. And it kind of informed how I wanted to make music later. I wanted to make music that also sent people's brains on journeys and showed them pictures and set off little movies in their heads. So the combination of banging on the piano and listening to Sgt. Pepper's for 5 years straight without listening to any other albums kind of laid the foundation for who I am as a musician. It's kind of punk rock, banging on a piano, and kind of psychedelic, listening to the Beatles. And so as I grew up and actual punk rock came around, I was like, oh yeah, please, that's for me. I loved the do-it-yourself kind of vibe of it. I remember seeing the Sex Pistols in a magazine and thinking, I like that. Whatever they're doing, I want to do it. I didn't have any gear at the time, so I started recording with 2 boomboxes and stolen cassette tapes from my mom's French lessons. So a lot of my recordings had my mom speaking French in between the songs, which was kind of great. And that was, like a sound on sound thing. I'd bounce from one boombox to the other boombox and back and forth. And, eventually my mom took pity on me, probably to preserve her cassette collection, and bought me a 4-track. And that was incredible. That was like being given the keys to the kingdom. And I just really loved recording. I loved the thrill of the moment of multi-tracking myself, of making things happen in that, special sonic space that I had previously been just a listener to. And now I felt like I was participating. And I think that also kind of informed how I eventually came around to making music, which is, be happy in the moment and be happy with what you're doing, because there's a good chance nobody will ever hear it or it won't be successful. And just being kind of centered in the moment is something that I think I got out of those first 4-track experiments. And a lot of the songs I wrote back then were kind of like rejection of comfort and rejection of my sort of middle class upbringing, just so I could rail against something, and eventually I started kind of playing with other people and getting into the sort of early punk rock scene in Seattle. And also, again, the do-it-yourself idea was reinforced then. And eventually I went to college in New York and, started a band there, and went to Boston and started bands there and started busking in Boston, which was super fun. And that was like a way to kind of also keep that do-it-yourself aesthetic alive. Like I didn't need to book a show or get somebody's approval to play a live show. I could just gather up my gear and go down to the subway or go to Harvard Square and play. And it was a really great little loop, like a closed loop of success. Like I felt like I was successful. I could write a song, I could record it on my 4-track, I could make a little cassette, a series of songs on a cassette, I could make copies of it, I could put it in my bag, I could go to the subway, play music, sell my little cassettes, and entertain people. And I was like, that's it, I'm done. It was perfect. So I was pretty much envisioning that as my life forever. I didn't think about anything more, really. During that time, I met Mary Lou Lord, who is another busker on the scene in Boston. And we used to do this thing where we would trade time like if she got a really good spot in Harvard Square, I would go hold her spot by playing some songs while she went to use the bathroom. We would do that for each other if we noticed each other busking, and the other one wasn't. So that was kind of a bonding experience between she and I. And then eventually she and I started a band called Strumpet, and we played around in Boston a bit, and just for a little moment. And then I ended up moving back to Seattle. I woke up one morning, I was living in Boston, and I was kind of not feeling great, and I was not eating well, and I had, health issues, and I was tired and getting sick a lot, and my music was really kind of getting heavy. And all of a sudden I woke up one morning and I thought, oh, I am from Seattle. Why don't I go back to Seattle? Because Nirvana had released Nevermind, and I had been messing around with melodic dark music myself. And I remember hearing that record and thinking, whoa, okay, I don't have to try to make the record I'm trying to make. I'll just listen to this one. It was that close to what I was trying to do. So I felt like, I better hightail it back home. So I did, and the experience of arriving home was so fantastic. Just like, I don't know, this feeling of belonging, of the atmosphere of the Northwest, the sort of swampiness, the dirt, the worms, the fungus of this particular place made me really, really happy. And so I wrote a whole bunch of songs that ended up being sort of the kindling for the presidents of the United States of America. I really bottled that joy of coming back home. Still, I'm just, seeing music as something that I do to alleviate boredom, maybe a little bit, like, get together with friends and play on a Tuesday night at the rock club, just to have something to do on a Tuesday night. And life was simple and easy and improvisational. I never knew where the day was going to take me. And it was a really beautiful time. It was fantastic. During that time, I started working for my older brother at home, making phone calls to set up appointments for him to go sell computer networks to local businesses. So it was great because I could roll out of bed, I could work on my 4-track for a bit, write some songs, make some phone calls. If I got inspired, I would stop making phone calls and record songs. I remember recording several Presidents demos during that time, in between phone calls to local businesses for my brother. And one of those days, my phone rang, and it was Mary Lou. And she was still in Boston, and she was saying that I needed to check out this guy, Beck, who was just signed, and shared a publisher with Mary Lou. And the publisher had let Mary Lou know that Beck was wanting to put a live band together, and he needed musicians. And Mary Lou immediately thought of me. So she was calling me to say that I should throw my hat in the ring as a sideman for this guy, Beck. Now, we all know who Beck is now, and that seems like an obvious choice. But at the time, I also had the choice of joining a friend's band called Flop here in Seattle. They needed a bass player. And so I remember learning Flop's bass lines and learning the bass lines on the Beck Loser EP at the same time and thinking, now, which one am I going to choose, Beck or Flop? And you got to remember, it's as if somebody were to call you today and say, hey, there's this new artist, Spaghetti Johnson. He's going to be incredible. You got to be his side musician. And you'd be like, Spaghetti Johnson? I don't know if Spaghetti Johnson's really ever going to do anything. And these friends of mine in this band Flop are touring and having fun, and maybe I should join them. Anyway, eventually, Mary Lou called me back again because I was kind of hemming and hawing. And she said that Beck would be in Seattle in a few days, and she would be with him, and she could introduce me to him. And he was going to do 2 shows, one at the Crocodile Cafe and one at the OK Hotel. It's just him and his acoustic guitar. So I agree to meet him, and I get down to the Crocodile that night, and I'm kind of early, and because I'm terminally punctual, and I'm doodling on a napkin with a pen, felt tip pen. And I ended up doing this. I used to do free-form doodling back then. I had no idea where I was going to go when I started the drawing. I would just draw and let the drawing kind of unfold. And that particular night, the drawing that unfolded was 2 fish creatures. And in my mind, I called them sharks. And they had a piece of fabric in their teeth between them, like a swing. And on that swing, I put this classic snowman-shaped character with a bullseye on his belly and with a crown on his head. And I remember in college, I'd learned about the Surrealist movement and the Dada plays that they would write. And one of them was Ubuwa, about a rich bureaucrat. And he was a chubby individual with a bullseye on his chest, as I remember him, and kind of a hat, like a crown hat. And so I thought, well, this is 2 sharks fighting over a king. I didn't think anything of it, but I did save the drawing because I was saving everything back then, and put it in the back of in my back pocket. And in walked Beck and Mary Lou, and she introduced me, and we chatted a bit. And then he was basically up on stage a few minutes later, and I was watching the show, and it blew my mind. I loved it so much. His lyrics were so dense and visual and Dada and surreal, and little movies went off in my head, just like when I listened to the Beatles when I was, 2.5 years old in 1967. And afterwards, I told him that, and I think we bonded over that because the next night, we hung out again, and this was at the OK Hotel, and at that time, Loser was out, so he was doing acoustic guitar, but he was playing a digital audio tape backing track to do Loser, and he was just doing the vocal. So the second night, the DAT tape broke, and he didn't have a backing track, and he was kind of floundering up there a little bit. And I just impulsively jumped up on stage and grabbed one of his little keyboards, like a Casio or something, and started stomping my foot and singing in the microphone. And he kind of fell in, and then we fell in together. And then eventually this weird freeform freedom kind of exploded all over the stage, and we ended up on the floor with multiple harmonicas in our mouths, like having a harmonica duel, like an absurd harmonica contest. And it was amazing. And I'd never really felt that free with somebody. I just felt like I could do anything.
I had met Beck, and I was on tour with Beck, and Beck told me that he needed a bass player. He was putting a band together for a tour. And I said, well, I know a guy, but he plays, it's only a 2-string bass.
Here's Mary Lou Lord with how she remembers it.
I had a gig in Seattle. Oh God, I can't remember the name of the club, but I opened for Beck, and I told Chris, I said, Chris, bring your bass and bring an amp, and maybe after the show we can hang out, and I'll definitely, of course, introduce you, and you can just hang out and shoot the shit and play a little bit for him. And he's like, okay, cool. So I do the gig, and Chris comes, and he didn't bring a bass as far as I remember, what he brought was a box of harmonicas. And I'm like, oh, Jesus, right? So I introduced him before the show, and I opened, did the thing, hanging out with Chris. And then I thought later, okay, well, I'll after the show we can hang out, right? So I said, did you bring your bass? He's like, no, I brought these box of harmonica. It was like 14 harmonicas. And I'm just like, what the fuck, right? So anyway, Beck is doing his show and Chris is there. We're loving it. And Beck starts to do the song called Loser, right? And there's a harmonica solo in it. And Chris jumped on the stage. And I was just like, oh my God, what is he doing? What is he doing? Because, like I said, like Beck had just met him. And this is a guy that's going to audition to play bass, right? So Chris jumps on the stage with his box of harmonicas. And it was clear to Beck to go with it and do like a dueling harmonica, like a harmonica off, whatever you would call it, right? Like dueling harmonicas. And so Beck is doing his harmonica solo, and Chris picks up like one harmonica and starts playing it. Then two, then three, then four. Then he had like 6 harmonicas in his mouth. And Beck is just looking at him like, who is this guy? But he knew that he wasn't just some rando because I had just introduced him. And then people went absolutely nuts. It was incredible to watch the crowd dig this. And at the end of it, Chris grabbed Beck's arm and he raised it up and he said, the winner. It was just so amazing.
And a couple days later, actually it was the next day, he invited me down to Olympia. He was recording with Calvin Johnson in Calvin's basement, Calvin of K Records, making an album. And although he had just got signed, Beck had carved out a way that he could make albums on the side for smaller labels and just kind of be free to be weird at the same time as being a major label guy. So I went to the bus station. First I went to, he said he needed a slide guitar player. So first I went to the music store and I bought a slide guitar because I did not own one. Of course, I said, when he said he needed a slide guitar player, I said, of course I can play slide. I never played slide guitar before that in my life. So I went to the store, I bought a guitar, I bought a slide. I literally went right from the store to the bus station in Seattle. And this is a little bit of a side tangent, but when I bought the ticket to go to Olympia, the man behind the counter at the bus station slid me a $2 bill as change. And he said, everything's gonna change, as he slid me my change. And I still have that $2 bill hanging over the door of my studio. I've hung it over the door of my studio ever since because it turned out to be true. Everything did change, which I'll get to in a minute. So I get the $2 bill in my pocket. I get on the bus. I go to Olympia. I walk out of the bus. I walk down the street. I walk down another street. I walk into Calvin's house. I walk down into Calvin's basement and right into a recording booth where they say, play slide on this song. And I have never heard the song before in my life. So they start the playback. I start hunting around. It's kind of awkward and, choppy and that's what they were after. I mean, that's what Beck was after. He wasn't after a proficient slide guitar player. He was after somebody who could slide around on guitar. And really somebody who could play that bow, the signature riff in Loser, the bow, 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 bow. So I recorded on a few songs, played bass. I think I did a little vocals here and there. And then I ended up staying overnight and hanging around and walking around Olympia with Beck and Calvin and James Bertram and Sam Jane and all these people, and had a great time. I went home. Beck didn't say anything one way or another about getting together again or continuing to hang out or whatever. I went home, and 2 days later, I think it was, the phone rang, and it was Beck. And he said, how would you like to join my band and go on tour? And that was just that's the pinpoint exact moment when everything changed, when I realized that my foundation as a do-it-yourself artist was wonderful and a very comfortable place to be. But I think secretly, way deep down, having grown up with the Beatles especially, and thinking about the aspect of their experience, which was, screaming fans and adoration and hitting the big time, I think that little ember of big time desire was still smoldering in the back of my DIY brain. And when Beck said, "How'd you like to do it?" I thought, yes, absolutely. I would love to fan that little ember and see what happens. And so it was like my first time that I didn't have to have a day job. I could get paid to make music and be an actual professional. And I said yes, of course. I hung up the phone and I thought, I need to just take in this moment. This is it. And I went outside of my little house in Seattle and opened the door, and it was wintertime. I think it was January, and it was kind of fresh out, and there'd been a windstorm the night before. And the yard was kind of littered with various bits of garbage. And I saw one folded up piece of paper that I thought, what is that? And I picked it up and I unfolded it. And it was a big kind of off-white piece of paper, maybe 1.5 by 1 foot. It was the kind of paper that was given to elementary school kids when I was a kid, where it has kind of blue lines on the bottom and then a space up top for your drawing. And it's like for doing writing exercises, like a little story on the bottom and a place for a drawing on the top. And that's what it was. It was a kid's drawing with a kid's little sentence explanation on the bottom. And it was 2 fish or sharks fighting over a king. And the sentence the child wrote was, "One time, 2 sharks were fighting to see who would be king." And I immediately, of course, thought of the drawing I did right before I met Beck and thought, this is insanely bizarre that this theme of fighting over a king or fighting to see who would be king is presenting itself so randomly. So that just kind of blew my mind. I thought, well, between the ticket seller sliding me that $2 bill and saying everything's going to change like it's a Disney movie, and this Shark King drawing connection, I'm in for a wild ride, I thought. So I moved to LA because I was the only band member not from Los Angeles, and I lived with Beck. And when I arrived, he was in the UK doing Top of the Pops, and so his roommates invited me in. They were making music for pornos. Because if you make a piece of instrumental music at the time, if you made a piece of instrumental music and you gave it to somebody in the porn industry, they would give you $50 to buy it outright. So they were making money, basically. They were like, we got to pay the rent. We got to write this music for this porno. So I fell right in with them. I wrote a bunch of songs for the porno. We ended up being a band, and we actually played a gig. I don't know if you can swear on this thing or you can beep this out, but the name of the band was the Melon Fucking She-Males, which was also the name of the movie, which we eventually saw, and it was exactly what it sounds like. So that was my first intro to living in LA with Beck, and his roommates was making music for porn. And then he came back, and then we kind of hung out a little more, I think, than the other band members because I was living with him. So we would drive around LA, and we had some really interesting talks about, his transition from a 4-tracker, living in a cardboard box on the side of a hill, eating with his hands, working at a video store, to major label artist. And I really admired how he handled that. He stopped drinking, he stopped smoking, he bought a huge history book, Howard Zinn's history, People's History of America, I think it was. He sat in the back of the van and read that history book and just like absorbed culture, and really took his opportunity seriously. And all the conversations we had and all the kind of, performing together and hanging around 4-tracking a little bit in his house together and writing a couple songs together and driving around LA, talking about his transition. It was like I was going to fame school because the Presidents had already started, and then I went off with Beck. And so I felt like I was getting primed for my own experience in a way. It was like I was standing next to the eye of the storm without being in the eye of the storm. Or I guess the eye is calm, so maybe that's not the best analogy, but standing next to a tornado and not getting sucked in, but watching the tornado do its thing. So, eventually I kind of started to feel choked off by Beck, not for anything he did, but he was so in tune with his creativity and so genius and so quick and so surreal and nimble-minded and kind of such a force that the light coming off of him was burning me up. I lost myself in being his side guy. And I thought, you know what? I don't really want to lose myself. I've got this other band going. And in the meantime, Jason Finn, who worked at the Comet, had called me and said, we're selling demo cassettes over the bar like crazy. You got to come home. And so after 2 tours with Beck, I quit and I went back to do my own thing and got signed and had my own tornado to wrangle. And, getting signed was tricky because I kind of felt like with having, been with Beck, I had kind of gotten the sort of major label experience and I didn't really feel like I needed it for myself. But again, the ember of curiosity was flickering. Like, could I do this for not just be an accompanist to somebody who's experiencing, but could I do my own sort of ride in the big leagues? And so I got on the pony, and the pony was pooping gold bricks and driving and running as fast as it possibly could. And I held on for dear life. Eventually, though, pretty quickly, I realized it really wasn't for me. And I didn't know exactly why. And it was kind of sad and kind of disorienting because it's something I maybe secretly wanted my whole life. And then it was presented to me. And then I just didn't feel right. But I kept doing it because, it's a huge opportunity. So anyway, all that by way of saying that the sort of DIY way I came up was first challenged with my, collaboration with Beck. And then it was challenged even more when it was my turn to kind of, put on my big boy pants. Eventually, I have come around to realize that I am a solo artist, solo musician. I'm not really a band member. And I think in another way that I didn't quite get at the time, my time with Beck was super informative in that way too, because he was solo. And I kind of got to see what it's like to be the only guy in charge or the only one really, authoring the creative project. And although at the time I didn't understand that was also my fate, now I'm kind of drawing again on that experience to kind of solidify my choice to be a solo artist. I did music for little kids and their parents for 12 years. I made 19 albums and I did it all DIY, completely all alone by myself. So it's like I've come full circle back to being in charge of my own destiny in that sense. And I have that moment that I got that phone call from Beck and walked out in the yard and found that little drawing to thank for it. So that's the moment that I lived through.
Thank you, Chris, for that. Be sure to check out his website at chrisballew.org for details on his new album, Soul Unfolded, and to catch up with all of his musical projects as well as his artwork. Now, let's hear what Chris is inspired by these days.
One thing that's kind of inspiring me right now, believe it or not, is Radiohead. I'm a little late to the Radiohead game. I listened to OK Computer back in the 90s and I hated it. So I never listened to anything else, but now I'm kind of getting into them. And weirdly, I was watching a movie last night and the soundtrack really resonated with me. And I woke up this morning and went to listen to it. And it's by Johnny Greenwood from Radiohead. It's the soundtrack for the Jane Campion movie, The Power of the Dog. And so I did my stretching routine this morning to that. So I would say the soundtrack to The Power of the Dog is currently influencing me. I'm rereading Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now. I use it almost like a Bible. I just open it up to any old place and read for a little while. I am super inspired by Ram Dass and his perspective. There's a great movie called Becoming Nobody It's a documentary about Ram Dass, and everybody should watch it. So everybody can become nobody. I'm very inspired by the Beatles right now, again, because of the Get Back series, the Peter Jackson thing. I had a very visceral, emotional response to it. One part of the response was reminding me why I want to be solo and not in a band, because it's so hard to pull four brains in the same direction. And the other was spending 7.5 hours over 2 days immersed in that atmosphere. When it was over, I had a lot of empty, lonely feeling, or lonely, empty feeling, as if I was there and I missed those guys. Like I feel like I missed the Beatles, like I missed my friends. So that it was a very emotional and kind of intense experience. And I've heard that other people have had intense emotions after watching it. I'm also just very inspired perpetually by my wife, Kate Endel. She makes this incredible artwork, which is like happy and sparkly and folksy. And she also is DIY, and she's got animals in her art and funny little mushrooms. And I just am constantly tickled and inspired by my lovely wife. I know other people can't have her as their wife. They can't have her as their wife, but they can enjoy her art. So I would say that's something that's inspiring me.
That's it for today's episode. Thanks to Chris and special guest Mary Lou Lord for sharing their stories. Please be sure to check out my book, Live Through That, available everywhere now for more stories and photos. Remember, you can get 15% off using the promo code podcast15 by ordering at the link on the podcast page. And if you like this show, please subscribe so you'll know when the next episode comes out. And go ahead and tell your friends too. All right, thank you so much. We'll be back next week.